Madam Deputy Speaker, what a pleasure it is to serve under your chairmanship, particularly when we've had such a demonstration of moral relativism seen from these benches, such an apologia in many ways for a regime that has really done nothing to justify the explanations that have been permitted it. Madam Deputy Speaker, may I welcome the clarity that you have brought to this debate when all we have had from some parties is very much the opposite. We've had obfuscation, we've had deception, dissimulation, we have had all the tricks and all the turns that we are used to when we talk about a regime that has institutionalised lies, deception and dishonesty, not, as Churchill put it, as vanguards for the truth, but instead of the truth. These are not attempts to succeed to build a better world, but to destroy one that is trying to serve the people of these islands and our allies and friends. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm privileged to be speaking today about security, and we've heard, and no doubt we will hear more, about how security is built on military hardware, and you will not, quite understandably, hear me resiling from that point. But of course it's not just built on military hardware. It's not just built on the training teams that even now are defending or helping the Ukrainians to defend themselves against the Russian tanks. Who cares about the overflights over Ukraine when their tanks are actually in Donetsk and in the Donbass? Yeah. It's not just about the British battalion that is even now in Estonia, demonstrating to the Russians that the NATO commitment is real. Those British troops are not just there because they are capable, but they are there to demonstrate that an attack on one is an attack on all. I will take an intervention.
Very grateful for my honourable friend for giving way. Would he agree with me that it's very important to consider the fact that the Leader of the Opposition is on record publicly as stating his belief that NATO should be closed down? And would my honourable friend agree with you that that sends a deep signal of alarm across these benches?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, but of course he's slightly limited in what he said. He should have said, quite accurately, that this sends a deep signal of alarm across this House. Because actually this whole House, and I look here even at friends in the Scottish National Party and many on the Labour benches who will remember, of course, that who was it who built NATO?
Labour.
It was Clement Attlee. Who was it who built the independent nuclear deterrent? It was that Attlee government that recognised then that the United Kingdom had a role to play as a force for good in the world. That was an era when socialism loved Britain and didn't hate it. That was an era when socialism respected the West and didn't hate it. That was an era when socialism stood for something and didn't stand for nothing. I will give way.
In his speech a few moments ago, the Leader of the Opposition made reference to the 1930s and 1940s. Would my honourable friend agree that the one lesson which those unhappy decades teach us is that appeasement doesn't work?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, though he will forgive me if I do not join in the comparisons of Russia and Nazism. They are not accurate. Nazism was a hateful ideology that sought the death of millions, that deliberately sought to persecute and murder thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of many, including Jews and gays and gypsies. We're not dealing with that in today's Russia. We're not dealing with an ideology. We're dealing with a kleptocracy. We're dealing with a simple thieving regime under the leadership of one man who has enriched himself beyond the dreams of Croesus or avarice, who has made sure that even his cellist, a man none of us have ever heard of, has, according to the recent Panama Papers, earned more in his short life and professional career than any musician you have ever heard of. He has over $2 billion in assets, apparently. Who can dream of such wealth? Certainly not any of the musicians that we could name. And as a cellist, I should have stuck with those lessons, Madam Deputy Speaker. But we are dealing here with a very, very real state a very real threat, and that is why I particularly welcome that the Prime Minister herself, my right honourable friend, is here to lead this debate, as she has demonstrated not only through her premiership but through her time as Home Secretary how seriously she takes these matters, and I am grateful for her leadership. Very brief.
Very grateful to my honourable friend. Had I had the opportunity to ask the Leader of the Opposition my question in my intervention, I would have asked him whether he supported the continuation of our nuclear deterrent. Does he agree with me that that is absolutely critical and the linchpin of Western security? Yeah. I notice he's looking down.
My honourable friend will not be at all surprised to hear that I am not only very glad that we have maintained our nuclear deterrent, but I voted with favour to renew it, and I was very glad when my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, had to sadly use the word that she did at the dispatch box when asked if she would use that terrible weapon. The answer has to be yes. Not because she wishes to, but because the point of the nuclear deterrent is that it should never be used, and it will only deter if it might be. And so I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. But we are dealing, as I said, with a debate on security here, and we've focused more than I would have chosen, perhaps, on the military aspects of it. And I would like to turn to the diplomatic aspects and pay tribute again to the government for their success, and actually not just the government. There are members of benches on all sides who have used the past 2 weeks to speak to friends and allies across these islands, across this continent, and indeed around the world, to speak up and remind people why it is that we have called for aid at this moment, why it is that we have cited Salisbury and the attacks there as particularly important, and why it is that now is the time for them to stand up. And I remember very clearly a conversation I had only a few days ago with a minister in the French government when the committee was over there, and pointed out to her that she must be under no illusion as she talks about European defence cooperation, that as far as we see it, this is a moment for that defence to be shown real, for that alliance to be proved true, so that we can move forward and build on it. And I'm delighted to say that in our committee that was made up of parties from the Labour Party, from my own party and from the Scottish National Party, there was no divergence on this. There was complete unity, and I was very pleased with the message that we were able to convey, that the British people are united as one on this, whatever our divisions on other things, that this was an attack on the British people and not just on 2 people in a park in Salisbury. But of course this isn't just about diplomacy either. Overlooked, too often, are our intelligence services. In the security service and the secret intelligence services, in the government communications headquarters, there are people who are working even now, in secret and silence, to keep us safe and to ensure that we are prepared, we are ready, and indeed we never know about the next attack, because it didn't happen. That is so hard to measure, Madam Deputy Speaker, but it is the most essential element of our defence. Without it, we are blind. Without it, we are deaf. Without it, we cannot speak. And like the 3 wise monkeys, we would be left merely as an ornament and not as an actor. And Britain is nothing if not an actor on the world scene. And we have been so, because what we have done is we have played our part in the last 70 years in building the international order that has kept us safe. We have been instrumental, Madam Deputy Speaker, in the post-war era of building the United Nations, an organisation with many flaws, but without which we cannot imagine modern life. We have been instrumental in building NATO, another organisation which asks for many improvements, but still guarantees us to sleep safely in our bed. And we have been absolutely fundamental in writing some of the rules that underpin it too, and including, and I know I don't share the universal support of these benches, the European Convention on Human Rights, which has reflected British law around the continent. And the tragedy, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that you know who has partnered us throughout that journey, well, most of it, is the Russians. The Russians in the 1940s were part of the building of the New World Order. They were part of writing the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. The Soviet diplomats who were there at the UN were not our friends, Madam Deputy Speaker. They were already rivals. But they understood that the rules-based international order was something for all of us. In there was the guarantee that we could all have a future, we could all have a safe idea of where we were going. Now, of course, they challenged us on what that future would be. Their view of the future was actually Soviet despotism. But they still understood that there were rules that had to be applied. What we are seeing today, Madam Deputy Speaker, is the reverse. What we are seeing today is a Russia that does not believe in the rules. In fact, it actively believes in no rules. What it is doing, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is seeking out every tie that binds, every alliance, everything that you hold dear and true, and seeking to break it. And that is why, Madam Deputy Speaker, the repetition of lies by useful idiots, the propagandising of untruths by adjuncts, is not just a foolish thing to do, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is not just unwise, it is actually and actively harmful. That is why we stay away from Russia Today and Sputnik, not because they show an alternative vision, but because they deliberately undermine the truth. I will give way.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman giving way. He's making a very powerful speech, which I fully agree with. Can I say that when we were putting sanctions on Russia after they annexed Crimea, I was privy to information and discussions at the European Commission about how the octopus arms of the Russian state were all over the energy sector across the European Union, and they were using devious means to get their ways. Can I therefore invite him to take on the logic of his speech, that we use not just military but diplomatic means, so that we use energy policy to take the money away which is fueling Mr. Putin's military and intelligence?
The Right Honourable Member knows that I will, of course, agree with him, and that energy policy is absolutely essential to playing our hand properly in this response. And that is why I would urge my German friends here in this House, as I have done so face to face with them, is to not bow to the Russian idea of a pipeline straight to them, because it cuts out, effectively, it removes the diplomatic and the political leverage that countries to the east would otherwise have. And in doing so, actually, it weakens Germany. And it weakens all of us, because we are stronger when we stand together and weaker when we divide ourselves. And that is why we must look at Eastern Europe not as a sphere of influence, not as some do, as an area in which the West has provoked Russia, as though the Ukrainian people are some sort of slave adjunct to the Russian Empire. That is not true. They are free people, as we are free, as any country is free. And they have the right to determine their own future, and energy policy is being used as a weapon against them. But look, I must make a little progress, and if I do, forgive me as I speed through and point to a few of the violations and the lies that have been used, because we've heard cited Crimea, the first time a border has been changed by force since the Second War. We've heard about the occupation of Georgia, and I wish that Her Majesty's government would refer to it as such, because it is one. And we've heard time and again about the attacks in Montenegro, the lies in Berlin, the fraudulent electioneering in France, and possibly even the United States. We have heard again and again and again about these deceptions. And we must now hear much more actively about the response. And my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has set out some good starts, and I welcome them. She has set out some very strong ideas, and I welcome them. But what I want to now see is to see them being used. Because my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, said the other day in committee that he was looking forward to seeing the Magnitsky Act used, but it was not a political tool. And of course, technically he's right. It is a legal tool, and therefore for the police. But it will demand our embassy staff, it will demand our intelligence officers and others to put forward the cases so that police know who are those human rights abusers, who are those people who should be caught up in this. And of course it will also require the tools of our diplomats and our intelligence officers so that we know who are those oligarchs who are part of the Russian Kremlin mafia-controlled kleptocracy. We need to know them, we need to identify them, and by doing so, we need to act against them. But there is one last thing, if I may, Madam Deputy Speaker, that I will ask for, and that is that we look at Russian sovereign debt being traded here in London even now. We hear again and again about the importance of London's capital markets, and may I say, they will find few greater supporters than me. But through the London Clearing House, an absolutely essential element of world trade, which underpins in so many ways the debt markets that allow us all to prosper, we have links around the world. And one of those links, Madam Deputy Speaker, is to Russian sovereign debt. And the Russian government, unlike other governments, does not use Russian sovereign debt merely to finance itself. What it does is it's now using it to sanctions bust. They are using their own sovereign debt to refinance and capitalise organisations that have otherwise been banned. And one of them, Madam Deputy Speaker, is VTB Bank. Now, we heard about this a little while ago. This has been reported on, and I must pay tribute to the work of Emil Simpson on this, who has done extraordinarily well to expose so many of these issues. But we can use sovereign debt here, too, as a tool and as a weapon, because we are being fought on every single level in a cross-spectrum battle by an organisation that does not work for the Russian people but feeds off it. It does not work for prosperity but feeds off it. And it does not work for stability but destroys it. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome what my right honourable friend the Prime Minister has set out, and I look forward to supporting her as she enacts those policies.